Saudi Arabia can look almost unreal from above. A vast geometry of sand, black rock, pale mountains, and cities glowing where the landscape seems least willing to support them. What fascinates me is not simply the harshness, but the stubborn abundance of life that keeps appearing in places where water is scarce, shade is precious, and distance changes everything. Travel across this country, and the image of an endless desert begins to fracture into red canyons, ancient tombs, green highlands, palm-filled oases, crowded streets, and a brilliant sea. Some of these places feel monumental at first sight, while others reveal their importance quietly through a channel of water, a carved doorway, a rose field, or a weathered stone wall. The deeper question is what connects landscapes this different, and why human settlement has endured here for thousands of years, despite conditions that often seem almost impossible. I think the answer is hidden in the way people learn to read the land rather than fight it, finding opportunity in altitude, seasonal water, trade routes, coastlines, and sheer persistence. This journey follows that relationship from the emptiest dunes to some of the fastest changing cities in the Middle East, looking for the moments when geography begins to explain history. And somewhere between Rub al-Khali's silence and the lights of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia becomes far more complicated, intimate, and surprising than the desert image on the map. Saudi Arabia occupies most of the Arabian Peninsula, stretching from the Red Sea in the west toward the Arabian Gulf and the great deserts of the interior. It has no permanent rivers, so water has always arrived through other routes, from groundwater and springs to seasonal runoff, mountain rainfall, modern pipelines, and the sea itself. That single fact helps explain why settlements, farms, trade routes, and later cities developed so differently from those of river civilizations elsewhere in the world. The country is often described through heat and sand, yet its geography also includes high mountains, volcanic fields, sandstone canyons, coral-rich coasts, and agricultural pockets that can feel unexpectedly lush. Arabic and Islamic traditions shape daily life, but regional identities remain strong, and the atmosphere of a mountain town in Asir can feel remarkably different from central Riyadh or coastal Jeddah. I find that contrast more interesting than any record-breaking statistic because it shows how quickly a familiar idea of Saudi Arabia can become inadequate once the landscape begins to change. Modern infrastructure now links places that were once separated by daunting distances, but the older logic of geography is still visible in where water gathers, where roads pass, and where people built. To understand the country beyond its skyline, it helps to begin where human scale almost disappears, in a desert so immense that even direction can feel temporary. Rub al Khali does not announce itself with a single landmark because its power comes from repetition, ridge after ridge of sand extending until distance loses any useful meaning. Covering roughly 600,000 square kilometers across the southern Arabian Peninsula, it is among the largest continuous sand deserts on Earth and one of Saudi Arabia's most formidable landscapes. From the air, the dunes form long curves and intersecting patterns that look almost deliberate, although wind has been reshaping them for ages without any concern for human boundaries. Some dunes rise hundreds of meters, high enough to turn a vehicle below into a tiny moving mark that seems vulnerable against the scale surrounding it. I think this is where the word empty becomes misleading, because the desert is visually full of movement even when almost nothing living appears in the frame. Light changes the color of the sand from pale gold to copper, then deepens the shadows until each ridge looks sharper and the landscape seems to fold over itself. Between some dune systems lie hard flats and traces of ancient wetter periods, reminders that even this extreme environment has not always looked the way it does today. Beneath the present desert are records of older lakes and changing climates, making the empty quarter less like a timeless void and more like a landscape caught in one dramatic chapter. For travelers in earlier centuries, the danger was not simply heat, but uncertainty, because a known well, a seasonal grazing area, or a reliable route could determine whether a journey continued. Bedouin knowledge turned that uncertainty into a mental map built from stars, wind, terrain, memory, and generations of experience that outsiders could rarely read with the same confidence. There is something deeply humbling about that expertise, especially when modern viewers can cross the same spaces with satellite navigation and still feel disoriented by the lack of familiar reference points. The desert also creates an unusual acoustic feeling, where engines, footsteps, and wind can seem startlingly distinct because there are so few competing sounds. At midday, the landscape can appear almost bleached by brightness, while late afternoon gives the dunes depth and makes every crest look like the edge of another hidden world. Yet the beauty should not romanticize the difficulty, because temperatures, isolation, shifting sand, and limited water have always demanded careful preparation from anyone moving through this region. What keeps me curious is the idea that routes once crossed parts of this apparent emptiness, carrying people, animals, stories, and goods between communities that depended on precise knowledge of scarce resources. Seen this way, Rub al Khali is not the absence of history, but a place where history left lighter marks, many of them easily covered by the next wind. The desert strips the story down to essentials: movement, memory, water, and the decision to continue when the horizon offers almost no reassurance. After so much open sand, the carved cliffs of Al Ula feel almost shocking, because suddenly the desert begins to reveal walls, gardens, monuments, and unmistakable evidence of long human ambition. Al-Ula changes the emotional temperature of the journey immediately, replacing the endless horizontals of open desert with vertical sandstone cliffs, narrow passages, palms, and rock formations shaped by wind. At the center of its archaeological story lies Hegra, the first site in Saudi Arabia, inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and one of the best preserved Nabatean sites south of Petra. More than 100 monumental tombs were cut into the rock here, many with carefully designed facades dating mainly from the 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE. The precision is what catches my attention, because the surrounding sandstone is irregular and weathered, yet the entrances emerge with straight lines, balanced proportions, and deliberate decorative details. These were not random graves in an isolated wilderness, but monuments connected to a society positioned along routes that linked southern Arabia with the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Inscriptions preserved around Hegra add voices to the stone, offering names, warnings, ownership statements, and traces of languages used by communities moving through this trade landscape. Knowing that caravans once approached through this dry terrain changes the view, because every cliff and open corridor begins to feel less remote and more like part of an ancient network. Nearby Al-Ula's oasis created a different kind of continuity, where palms, cultivation, shade, and settlement could survive because water was available in a landscape otherwise dominated by rock and desert. That contrast between carved tombs and living greenery is one of the details I find most affecting, since it reveals how closely remembrance and survival occupied the same narrow valley. Natural landmarks such as Elephant Rock need no human carving to feel theatrical, because erosion has already shaped the sandstone into forms that immediately invite the imagination to participate. Other arches, pillars, and isolated masses of rock make the region visually generous, giving filmmakers the rare advantage of changing scale and composition without leaving the same geological world. But Hegra becomes more powerful when the camera moves closer and the grandeur gives way to tool marks, weathered edges, shadowed doorways, and details that remind us real hands produced these facades. There is a quiet uneasiness in looking into those dark entrances, not because they are frightening, but because the people who commissioned them once expected their names and status to endure. Much of their world has disappeared, while the stone outlived the routes, political systems, and daily conversations that once made these monuments feel ordinary to local eyes. I think that imbalance between fragile human memory and durable rock gives Al-Ula much of its emotional force, beyond the simple fact that the scenery is spectacular. At sunset, the cliffs warm dramatically, and the architecture seems to merge back into the geology from which it was cut, as though human design and erosion briefly speak the same visual language. The oasis then offers a softer counterpoint, with palms and cultivated ground reminding us that monuments alone never sustain communities. Water, food, labor, and exchange do. That practical reality keeps the ancient landscape from becoming a fantasy, because every impressive facade still depended on ordinary systems of survival operating nearby. Al-Ula therefore works best not as a lost city cliché, but as evidence that desert civilizations could be connected, organized, technically skilled, and deeply aware of the routes passing through them. From carved stone, we now move to a place where the rock closes in around the traveler, and where a narrow green floor transforms a canyon into one of northern Saudi Arabia's most surprising corridors. Wadi al-Disa lies in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, where tall sandstone walls rise around a valley floor that can look improbably green against the surrounding arid country. The wadi is part of the Prince Mohammed bin Salman Natural Reserve, and its scale becomes clearer when vehicles and palm clusters appear beneath cliffs that dominate the frame. Unlike the openness of Rub al-Khali, this landscape constantly narrows the view, directing the eye along rock faces, bends, shaded passages, and ribbons of vegetation. That enclosure creates a different kind of tension because the traveler is no longer exposed to an infinite horizon, but drawn deeper into a corridor whose next turn remains hidden. Seasonal water and local springs help support palms and other vegetation in parts of the valley, creating the green contrast that makes Wadi al-Disa so visually distinctive. I find the presence of water here more compelling because it is not overwhelming. It appears in modest quantities, yet those quantities are enough to reorganize the entire mood of the canyon. Where moisture reaches the ground, color gathers around it, and suddenly shade, trees, cultivated patches, and animal life become easier to imagine. The sandstone itself carries layers of time, with erosion cutting narrow openings and broad amphitheater-like walls that change character as sunlight moves across them. Nabatean and Kufic inscriptions found in the wider area also remind us that people crossed and understood these valleys long before they became destinations for modern road trips. That historical trace matters because a wadi was never merely scenery. It could be a route, a shelter, a reference point, and occasionally a precious place where water altered the possibilities of travel. The canyon invites dramatic drone footage, but I think the quieter shots near palms and shallow water tell the more important story about why humans notice certain places in a desert. A single patch of green becomes meaningful when everything outside it is dry, and a few degrees of shade can feel like infrastructure created by the landscape itself. Moving through the valley, the cliffs repeatedly hide what comes next, giving the sequence a natural curiosity that does not require exaggerated narration. Every bend can reveal another wall of stone, another group of palms, or another open pocket where the canyon briefly relaxes before tightening again. Wadi al-Disa shows that Saudi Arabia's dry geography is not uniform, and that the most memorable places often exist precisely where water and rock interrupt the expected pattern. Arriving visually in Asir after the northern deserts can feel almost like entering another country, because green slopes, cloud, forested ridges, and mountain roads replace the dominant palette of sand. The region stretches along the Sarawat Mountains in southern Saudi Arabia, with Abha serving as one of its best-known urban centers and a gateway to the surrounding highlands. Elevation changes the climate here, bringing cooler conditions and more seasonal rainfall than much of the Saudi interior, which allows vegetation to spread across slopes that would seem unlikely elsewhere. Mist can gather around ridgelines and partially erase the valleys below, creating scenes that feel soft and uncertain, rather than hard-edged like the open desert. I think this is one of the most important visual surprises in the entire film, because it immediately challenges the idea that Saudi geography can be summarized by dunes and heat. Mountain farms and terrace slopes show another response to limited usable land, with agriculture adapting itself to elevation instead of searching for broad plains. Traditional settlements in Asir also reflect local materials and mountain conditions, producing a regional architectural character distinct from the monumental stone of Hegra or the glass towers of Riyadh. Roads curve along steep terrain, and the physical effort required to connect communities becomes visible in every switchback cut across the slopes. On clear days, viewpoints open across enormous layers of mountains, while on cloudy days the landscape contracts until nearby trees and cliffs appear to float in mist. That changeability gives Asir a cinematic rhythm of its own, because the same location can move from expansive to intimate within minutes as weather crosses the ridge. Vegetation also changes the soundscape, adding birds, rustling leaves, and the softer ambience of mountain air to a journey that has so far been dominated by wind and exposed stone. There is a particular pleasure in seeing dense green against dark mountain rock, not because greenery is rare on Earth, but because of everything the journey has shown immediately before it. The contrast makes rainfall feel tangible, almost visible as an organizing force that decides where trees can gather, where farms can hold, and where settlements become comfortable. Abha adds a human scale to this environment, mixing contemporary city life with access to viewpoints, parks, villages, and highland routes across the wider Asir region. The cooler climate has long made these mountains attractive during hotter periods elsewhere in the kingdom, reinforcing the sense that altitude here functions almost like a different latitude. What stays with me most is the idea that Saudi Arabia contains its own climatic escape, created not by distance from the desert, but by rising above it. Even so, life in the mountains has its own constraints, from steep terrain and variable weather to the challenge of farming and building on limited level ground. That prevents the greenery from becoming a simple paradise image, because every terrace and hillside road still represents adaptation to a demanding environment. Asir feels generous compared with the empty quarter, yet its beauty is inseparable from the work required to live vertically, follow the rain, and make use of narrow pockets of fertile land. From these clouded heights, our journey turns east toward a very different form of green, one that rises not across mountains, but from an oasis surrounded by the dry plains of Al-Hassa. Al-Hassa Oasis in eastern Saudi Arabia is a landscape where the color green spreads not from mountain rain, but through springs, wells, canals, gardens, and generations of water management. UNESCO describes the cultural landscape as containing gardens, drainage systems, historic buildings, archaeological sites, and around 2.5 million date palms. The number is impressive, but the feeling becomes clearer at ground level, where dense palms create shade and make the outside desert seem suddenly distant. Settlement in this region reaches back thousands of years, showing how dependable access to water could turn an arid environment into a long-lived center of agriculture and community. Taif sits high in the Sarawat Mountains of western Saudi Arabia, where elevation softens the heat and creates conditions very different from the plains below. The city is widely associated with roses, especially fragrant varieties cultivated on mountain farms and processed into rose water, perfumes, and other traditional products. During the flowering season, the agricultural landscape gains a delicate color that feels almost improbable after so many kilometers of stone, sand, and exposed earth. What interests me is the intimacy of this crop, because the value of a rose is experienced through scent and touch rather than the monumental scale that dominates so much of Saudi scenery. Farm work begins long before the blossoms appear, and the short harvest period concentrates attention on timing, freshness, and the careful handling of flowers before their fragrance is lost. Traditional distillation turns baskets of petals into rosewater and aromatic oil, connecting a beautiful field to a practical craft that families and producers have refined over generations. The process is visually modest compared with a skyscraper or archaeological facade, yet it carries an emotional warmth precisely because human hands remain so close to every stage. Mountain breezes, gardens, and sloping roads give Taif a softer rhythm, and I think that change of pace is essential before the film returns to the enormous scale of the capital. The wider highlands also demonstrate how altitude creates agricultural opportunities in a country where lowland heat and limited rainfall often restrict what can be grown. Here, geography does not disappear. It becomes fragrance, harvest schedules, terrace edges, cooler evenings, and the decision to cultivate a crop suited to the mountain environment. There is something memorable about that transformation, because a harsh national stereotype is overturned not by argument, but by a field of small flowers moving in highland air. Taif reminds us that adaptation is sometimes spectacular and engineered, but it can also be seasonal, patient, and almost invisible outside the weeks when the landscape blooms. As the mountains fall behind, the scale changes again, and highways begin to draw us toward a city where millions of lives now depend on infrastructure operating across the desert. Riyadh is the opposite of a rose valley in almost every visual sense, yet both places reveal how strongly Saudi life continues to be shaped by the conditions beneath and around it. Riyadh rises from the Najd Plateau with a confidence that can feel almost confrontational, a vast capital of highways, towers, neighborhoods, construction sites, and intense urban movement surrounded by arid land. The city's name is historically connected with gardens, yet the modern metropolis has expanded far beyond the scale of the older settlements that once occupied this interior environment. Today, Riyadh is Saudi Arabia's political and administrative center, and its size makes the contrast with the surrounding desert impossible to ignore. From a high viewpoint, roads stretch in multiple directions until buildings dissolve into haze, revealing an urban footprint that is difficult to understand from street level. I think the most striking question is not why Riyadh became important, but how a city of this magnitude keeps functioning in a region without a permanent river beside it. Water arrives through modern systems that draw on groundwater and large-scale national supply infrastructure, turning an old geographic limitation into a continuing engineering challenge. Electricity, cooling, transport, food distribution, and water all have to operate reliably across a climate where summer heat can make ordinary urban life enormously energy-intensive. That dependence gives the skyline a different meaning, because every illuminated tower is supported by networks that are mostly invisible from the cinematic aerial view. Masmak Fort offers a sharp historical counterpoint, its mud brick form recalling an earlier Riyadh, whose political importance grew long before the present forest of high-rises. The distance between the fort and the modern skyline can be crossed quickly today, but visually it compresses more than a century of transformation into a few city blocks. New districts, commercial centers, cultural venues, and major infrastructure projects continue to reshape the capital, making change itself one of Riyadh's most recognizable characteristics. For a narrator, that speed creates excitement, but also a slight unease, because the city seems to be negotiating with geography at a scale earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. The heat has not disappeared, the desert has not moved, and water has not become naturally abundant. Instead, technology has become powerful enough to make those limits less visible in daily life. That distinction matters because modern comfort can easily hide the physical systems required to sustain it. At night, the transformation feels even more dramatic, when traffic lines, illuminated towers, and dense neighborhoods replace the visual emptiness of the desert with a field of human light. I find Riyadh most compelling at that hour, not because the city looks futuristic, but because the darkness beyond its edges reminds us how abrupt the concentration of life really is. The capital represents a new chapter in Saudi adaptation, where survival is no longer about finding a single oasis, but about coordinating infrastructure for millions of people every day. To feel that modern chapter at its most cinematic, we move upward toward the skyline, where Riyadh's architecture turns the ambition of the city into visible form. Riyadh's skyline is still evolving, but several towers already function as visual signatures, none more recognizable than the Kingdom Center, with its distinctive opening near the top. Against a flat desert horizon, vertical architecture carries unusual force, because height becomes a declaration in a landscape historically defined by distance rather than elevation. Glass facades catch the changing light and can shift from bright silver to warm gold before becoming dark mirrors after sunset. The effect is beautiful, yet I find the scale slightly disorienting when the camera pulls back and reveals how rapidly the towers give way to lower neighborhoods and open land. That wide shot tells more than a close-up, because it places modern ambition and desert geography in the same frame without needing to explain the contrast. Kingdom Center also represents a Riyadh that increasingly presents itself through business, design, leisure, and global urban culture, rather than through administrative power alone. From elevated viewpoints, traffic streams below like a circulation system, showing how dependent the vertical city remains on movement across enormous horizontal distances. The skyline therefore works best as a symbol of concentration, gathering capital, technology, people, and energy into forms visible from kilometers away. I think its emotional power comes from knowing that almost none of this visual abundance is effortless in an interior desert environment. Down at street level, the towers become only one part of the story, And the more revealing question is how millions of ordinary journeys are now reorganizing Riyadh from below. Street level replaces the abstract skyline with delivery vehicles, commuters, cafes, intersections, construction barriers, families, workers, and the ordinary repetition that makes a metropolis feel real. Riyadh's broad roads have long carried much of that movement, but the city now also has a metro network designed to shift large numbers of passengers across the capital. The trains introduce a new visual rhythm, moving through stations and corridors that feel controlled, cool, and engineered against the heat outside. I think the contrast between an air-conditioned platform and the bright desert sun beyond the entrance says more about modern Saudi life than another panoramic skyline ever could. Infrastructure here is experienced physically, through shorter journeys, sheltered spaces, organized transfers, and the ability to cross parts of a huge city without depending entirely on a car. The streets still reveal how spread out Riyadh remains, with long distances separating residential areas, offices, shopping districts, and new development zones. That scale can feel exhilarating from a moving camera, but it also reminds us that every expansion adds new demands for transport, water, cooling, and electricity. Urban life, therefore, becomes another form of adaptation, less visible than a desert caravan, but equally dependent on understanding distance and resource limits. Riyadh is not finished, and perhaps that is the most honest way to film it, as a capital still negotiating what its next version will look and feel like. From the interior, we now travel west until the land ends at the Red Sea, where Saudi Arabia's relationship with water becomes maritime, commercial, and intensely urban. Jeddah opens toward the Red Sea, and after the dry interior, the simple presence of a vast blue horizon changes the emotional balance of the journey. The city grew through its maritime position, connecting Arabian trade and pilgrimage routes with ships arriving from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the Indian Ocean world. Historic Jeddah became known as the gateway to Mecca for pilgrims arriving by sea, giving the port a cosmopolitan character shaped by centuries of movement. That history makes the coastline feel active rather than decorative, because the sea has long carried people, goods, livelihoods, and ideas toward the city. Offshore, the Red Sea supports coral reefs and rich marine habitats, introducing colors and forms that seem almost extravagant beside the muted earth tones of the desert. I find that underwater contrast especially powerful, as though an entirely different Saudi landscape begins the moment the camera passes below the surface. Coral structures create shelter for fish and other marine life, turning the coast into an ecological world whose complexity is easy to miss from a highway or waterfront promenade. The sea also moderates the visual mood, replacing sharp desert horizons with reflective water that changes constantly under wind, cloud, and the angle of the sun. Yet Jeddah's relationship with the Red Sea is practical as well as beautiful, with ports, shipping, fishing, coastal development, and recreation all competing for space along the shore. The fish market offers a brief but valuable human detail, bringing the marine environment back to daily routines of sorting, selling, bargaining, cooking, and feeding the city. Modern neighborhoods extend far beyond the historic core, revealing a metropolis whose identity is no longer confined to the old port, but still remains inseparable from the coast. At sunset, the Red Sea can make Jeddah appear calm, but ships on the horizon and traffic along the waterfront keep reminding us that this is a working city. I think the most interesting tension here is between leisure and labor, because the same water can be a place for diving, a shipping corridor, a food source, and a backdrop for urban life. That multiplicity gives editors many ways to change pace, moving from reef detail to aerial coastline, from boats to streets, and from quiet water to dense city movement. For a country so strongly associated with desert, ending the geographic journey at the sea also feels like a deliberate correction to the image we began with. Saudi Arabia is not simply surrounded by water. Parts of its history have always depended on what could cross that water and arrive at its western shore. One object on the coast captures that maritime history in a more melancholy form: a large vessel that once moved people and cargo, but now remains fixed beside the Red Sea. The rusting Al Fahad shipwreck turns movement into stillness, giving us an unexpected doorway into Jeddah's industrial and maritime memory. Ports rarely look romantic from close range, yet cranes, containers, piers, hulls, and loading areas reveal the machinery that keeps a coastal city connected to distant economies. Jeddah's maritime importance has changed form over centuries, but the basic advantage of its Red Sea position remains visible whenever another vessel approaches the coast. South of the city, the Al Fahad wreck offers the opposite image: a former ferry that once traveled active routes but now rests abandoned near the shoreline. I find the wreck strangely affecting because a ship is designed around movement, schedules, destinations, and return journeys, while this one has been reduced to weather, rust, and tide. Its tilted structure breaks the clean line between sea and sky, creating a dramatic visual that feels almost too cinematic to be accidental. Marine life has begun using parts of the wrecked structure as habitat, adding a quiet second life to a vessel whose human purpose ended long ago. The scene is not an ancient ruin, which is precisely what makes it feel different from Hegra. Its decay belongs to a world close enough for us to recognize. Nearby port activity makes the contrast sharper, with functioning ships continuing the movement that Al Fahad can no longer perform. Together, the harbor and wreck show two states of maritime history at once: commerce still accelerating and a machine slowly surrendering to the coast. From here, Jeddah expands beyond docks and wreckage into a modern metropolis, where the Red Sea remains present even when the camera turns inland toward towers, roads, and neighborhoods. Modern Jeddah feels more fluid than Riyadh, partly because the sea gives the city an open western edge and a horizon that remains visible from many coastal districts. Roads, apartment blocks, villas, commercial areas, mosques, hotels, and new developments spread along a metropolitan corridor shaped by both regional growth and the pull of the waterfront. The Red Sea Corniche has become one of the clearest expressions of contemporary coastal life, where public space, recreation, architecture, and sea views meet. Families gather near the water, traffic continues behind them, and the city seems to alternate constantly between movement and pause. I think this is where Jeddah becomes emotionally warmer in the film, because the landscape invites people to linger rather than simply cross it. Even ordinary shots of residential streets matter here, showing that behind famous landmarks is a city built from routines that rarely appear in tourism montages. Modern villas and dense neighborhoods reveal different layers of prosperity and urban planning, while construction suggests that the city's physical form is still changing. Jeddah's climate is hot and humid compared with the dry interior, so the sea that gives the city its beauty also shapes the bodily experience of walking through it. That humidity changes the light as well, often softening distant buildings and giving sunsets a hazier, more diffused character than those over the central desert. Commercial life reflects Jeddah's long openness to travelers and merchants, with food, accents, family histories, and cultural influences carrying memories of older maritime connections. The city's role as a gateway for pilgrims also continues to influence its identity, even as highways, airports, hotels, and modern services have transformed the scale of arrival. What fascinates me is how easily several centuries can coexist in one sequence: a modern roadway, a glimpse of coral stone architecture, a container ship, then the open sea. None of those images tells the whole city alone, but together they explain why Jeddah feels difficult to reduce to a single era. At night, waterfront lights stretch along the coast and turn the shoreline into a visible boundary between dense urban life and the dark Red Sea. The scene can feel celebratory, yet I prefer to leave a little space for the quieter thought that this coast has witnessed countless departures whose stories were never recorded. Every port city accumulates such absences, people who arrived, stayed, traded, prayed, worked, or disappeared into another voyage. That human continuity leads naturally toward Al-Balad, where the architecture itself preserves evidence of Jeddah's older relationship with heat, trade, family life, and the sea. In the historic streets, the city becomes smaller again, and details in wood, coral stone, markets, windows, and doorways begin to replace the grand scale of highways and towers. Al-Balad, the historic heart of Jeddah, preserves an urban texture of narrow streets and traditional buildings that developed through the city's long role as a Red Sea trading and pilgrimage port. UNESCO recognizes historic Jeddah for its distinctive Red Sea architectural tradition and for its importance as a gateway used by pilgrims traveling onward to Makkah. Many older houses were built with coral stone and shaded by projecting wooden roshan, practical architectural features that also gave the city a remarkably recognizable visual identity. The narrow lanes reduced the scale of the journey once more, replacing desert panoramas and urban aerials with doorways, shop fronts, worn walls, balconies, and faces passing close to the camera. I find this shift deeply satisfying because history here is not separated behind a distant barrier. It survives inside streets where contemporary life continues around it. The nearby fish trade adds another everyday layer, connecting local meals and market routines directly to the Red Sea beyond the Old City. A few seconds of sellers handling the day's catch can say more about coastal continuity than a long list of maritime dates, because the relationship remains visible in ordinary work. Preservation is important precisely because these buildings are vulnerable, and losing them would erase not only decorative facades but evidence of how people adapted architecture to climate, commerce, and family life. Jeddah leaves me with a sense of accumulated movement, as though every alley points both toward the sea and toward the generations that entered the city from it. Before traveling, check the latest Saudi visa and entry requirements through official government or Visit Saudi channels, because eligibility and procedures can change by nationality and travel purpose. Saudi Arabia is enormous, So plan the route by region rather than trying to connect distant places casually, and consider domestic flights or long road transfers when the map begins to deceive you. For desert and lowland destinations, carry water, sun protection, and suitable footwear, and schedule demanding outdoor activities for cooler parts of the day whenever possible. Highland areas such as Asir and Taif can feel much cooler than Riyadh or Jeddah, so packing a light extra layer is surprisingly useful when elevation and evening weather change the temperature. Visitors should dress modestly and respectfully in public, while also paying attention to local customs at religious, historic, and family-oriented places. Reserve major heritage experiences in advance when booking is required, especially if a specific time of day matters for photography, guided access, or limited entry areas. In Riyadh, the metro can be useful for selected urban journeys, but across the wider country, a flexible combination of public transport, taxis, rental cars, tours, and flights is often more practical. Most importantly, leave enough time between destinations, because Saudi Arabia becomes far more rewarding when a canyon, oasis, old street, or mountain road is allowed to breathe instead of becoming another rushed stop. Saudi Arabia began this journey as a landscape of extremes, but what remains with me is the variety hidden inside those extremes. Dunes, carved tombs, green mountains, oases, megacities, old streets, and open sea. I think its most compelling story is not that people defeated a difficult environment, but that generation after generation learned to notice the narrow opportunities the environment was willing to offer. A palm grove in Al-Asa, a rose field above Taif, a road through Asr Cloud, and a glowing tower in Riyadh all feel different, yet each carries evidence of that continuing negotiation. The more closely we look, the less Saudi Arabia resembles a single image, and the more questions appear about what else is waiting beyond the places most travelers already know. If this journey gave you a new perspective, please like the video, share it with someone curious, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to World Untold so we can keep exploring together. Until the next journey, keep looking past the obvious landscape, because some of the world's most revealing stories begin exactly where the familiar picture stops.